Could you give a little bit for people who don't know the background of the Tulsa Massacre, and maybe a little bit about the Greenwood neighborhood and what was happening there, and just so people know?
Sure. It is a very common story, unfortunately, that Black people were subject to terrorist mob violence. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, in 1921, it all began, as these things often did, with a claim that a Black man had assaulted a white woman. A white mob formed, as always happens. What happened next was somewhat unusual. The Black community banded together to protect this young man and prevent him from being lynched. Very brave act. But the local authorities and local citizens banded together to attack the Black community of Greenwood. Over the period of 2 days, several hundred people were killed. It's not clear how many people were killed. Obviously, the people who committed the crime weren't going to count, but homes were destroyed, burned down. Basically, the Black community of Greenwood was destroyed, and the survivors were scattered to neighboring communities and out of the state of Oklahoma altogether. You just talked about how events like these are taken out of history. And this literally there were apparently newspaper stories, not just about the massacre, but that bombs were dropped on this community. The Oklahoma Air National Guard, that was in its infancy, but they pulled it together enough to drop bombs on people. And apparently there were newspaper accounts of this, but these newspapers were destroyed and the evidence disappeared and lived only in memory. Now, so no, you're not alone in not being taught the history of this Tulsa massacre or of the hundreds of other incidents like it. 2 years before, in 1919, it was called Red Summer. And there were attacks like this across the country against Black people in the North, in the South, in the Midwest. And those are just two. But there are many, many other incidents of Black people being driven out of their communities, mob attacks. And it is a good thing that this is now known, not just the events in Tulsa, but that it was not unusual, and it should not be treated as some unique event, because it was not.
Yeah. And, it's interesting because I have seen, since I learned about this and looked stuff up, there are photos. And there are photos from overhead, which, of course, substantiates the idea that there were airplanes and that were dropping bombs on this community. But the thing that I find so particularly insidious about all of it is that this seems to happen when Black communities are really rising up, right? No. So what people have to understand is that Greenwood was not just some ghetto somewhere. No. Okay. So this was, I mean, would you talk a little bit about what that was? Because I think that was really what was setting them off, was the success of that.
It was known as Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. It was called Black Wall Street. Now it's an irony of history, an irony of segregation, that Black people were forced often to serve themselves. So that meant there would be Black stores, Black businesses. If a Black person managed to go to law school or med school, segregation meant that they could not operate in white communities. So at that time, and for many decades afterwards, Black communities were very diverse. There were poor people, there were people doing better, there were people doing very well. And it's not the only time that the fact that people were prospering became and a cause of incitement against them. There was jealousy against them. There was the desire to keep Black people in their place. And so that was not unusual for prosperous Black people to be attacked in this manner. Having said that, I don't want to emphasize that too much. I know people don't intend, and I know Black people especially, we want to talk about how we excel despite terrible odds, especially at that time in history. But, Black people of every economic strata were subject to terrorism and mob violence. And I also don't want people to think that it was worse because the community was prosperous. I'm not saying that's your intention or anyone else's. But,
No.
I think we need to stop and think about emphasizing that fact, although it did, I believe, and many others believe, play a role in the authorities targeting those people.
Yeah.
Could you talk about how many of the members of the white mob were apparently deputized? They were legally allowed.
This was quite frequent. They would be deputized like a posse, like in the Westerns. But ordinary people would be deputized, meaning they had the power of law enforcement, which meant they had impunity. Now, often in other cases, no one bothered with that because just being white was to give one impunity. But yes, people were deputized. The National Guard came in. In fact, 2 years earlier in Elaine, Arkansas, which was one of the events in Red Summer, members of the armed forces, the Army, came in after Black sharecroppers began to demand that they receive fair prices for their crops. It started as an interracial effort and then descended into mob violence. The same thing with hundreds of Black people being killed. But law enforcement were very often the people who led the mob, who incited the mob, who would deputize the mob. And even if they didn't do all of those things, they would protect the perpetrators.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.